Welcome to the chat. We have a extra special podcast today. This is the latest in a series of interviews on the biggest issue facing both the city and the state, the affordable housing crisis. We are very fortunate this afternoon to have some of the movers and shakers that really have the ability to do something about the crisis. State Senator Mark Montigny is joining us, State Rep Chris Hendricks, and State Rep Tony Cabral will be joining us. He's a little bit delayed. And Josh Amaral, the Executive Director of the Office of Community and Housing Development. I got your moniker right there, Josh.
That's good. That'll work.
Close enough. So gone are the days, gone are the days when young middle class couples in their 20s and 30s could buy a house on a middle class salary in New Bedford. And now we're at the point where even young people trying to get an apartment, even with a roommate, sometimes are stressed. Both the city and state have done a lot in the last couple of years, but as local housing advocates point out, the United Interfaith Action religious group very concerned about housing with some respected local leaders on it, like Reverend David Lima, have expressed concern that it's a lot, but it's not enough. We have 7,000 people in need of affordable housing in the city. By way of background, on August 6th, Governor Maura Healey signed a $5.16 billion housing bond bill, far and away the largest in the state's history. Among just a few of the things the bill includes are $2 billion for a rehab of the way the state's public housing facilities can be renovated, $800 million for the Affordable Housing Trust to spur new construction, $425 million for housing stabilization and investment, and first time allowing by right something what we used to call mother-in-law units, accessory dwelling units, ADVs, that by right the state is going to, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong here, preempt local zoning to allow these things to get these units built if they're 900 square feet or less. So, and still we have the problem. So I like to start out asking, how did we get here? And, we always knew that New Bedford was just a little bit different than Greater Boston, which has been in a crisis for years. How did New Bedford get here? Senator Montigny?
Well, I mean, it's a small question with a huge answer, but let me just try to give like a clipped version because I know time is limited. And as you can see by looking at the screens, we're in a bit of a group therapy session today with 5 people who know how to talk. So I'll do my best to not violate my time zone. But before I get into the good news, we'll have time, I think, to talk about this $5 billion bond, which is clearly good news. It's the largest bond we've ever done in the legislature. And there's a lot of wonderful provisions in there, but certainly no magic bullet. So without getting into all of the market trends and the national trends and what has happened during and post-COVID, I want to talk specifically about some things that I consider the bad news side of the ledger before speaking about some of the solutions that are contained in the bond. Because some of the bad news stuff, some of it is uncontrollable. These are trends going on in the marketplace nationwide. To act as if we can somehow put out our hand and say stop, I think is naive, so I won't. But I do think that we meaning as a society, have created many of these problems. We have exclusionary zoning instead of inclusionary zoning. And I mean, if there ever was an example of the most extreme local myopic NIMBY zoning, it's around housing. And just one example, I can remember reading Commonwealth magazine when there was a gubernatorial candidate named Seti Warren that came from a very liberal democratic community up around Boston. And they did an expose because he had been talking about all of the progressive policies that many of us on this call support, or many of us on this Zoom support. And it talked about how much that he and his community had stood in the way of what I refer to, referred to technically as 40B, but it is what it is. It's anti-snob zoning, and it's called that way and characterized that way because it's exactly to reverse the NIMBY or snob zoning. And here was one of the more liberal communities in the state doing everything they could to prevent affordable housing development. So a lot of that local zoning, even having to fight to have these accessory units put in. I mean, people own the property. We live in a society of private property owners or those that are at the whim of those owners as renters. And yet We allow local zoning to prevent even the use of your own property to provide affordable housing. We also have a very slow permitting process in this Commonwealth that many, including many calls to my office, complain as developers. And I mean, many times these are small developers. These are folks that just want to build another unit, or they want to build a duplex. And I had one this week. And as one of the busiest constituent service offices in the state, I don't just get this by listening to your show or WBSM or reading The Light or the Standard Times. I get it firsthand every day from people that I never thought I'd hear from that can't afford to pay rent. Now, there's some reasons for that. They got pushed out of places like Boston and they discovered this beautiful place. I'm looking from my office out on the harbor in Buzzards Bay. They finally discovered the nicest gateway city in the state. And I mean that, not as a promotion for us. It's true. But people have come down here from elsewhere thinking it's cheap here. And those that were used to affordable housing here have seen themselves priced out. One last thing before I stop. You also have empty lots and empty abandoned buildings that take months or years to develop, and they should not. A faster permitting, and this bill, by the way, this bond does more than just pay for things. It changes policy to empower communities to more quickly take these properties. It's a complex process. It's a legal process, but they should be taken. There should not be ownership by the state and the local government of these lots and abandoned buildings. They should be quickly moved into the private sector. Lastly, because I'm talking about the things we've done as a Commonwealth and as a community to prevent development. The last is that I think most of these bonding programs have been developed partly by well-connected developers who lobby much better than the homeless, much better than people who can't afford rent, much better than the first-time homeowner. And they have owned these programs, and there has not been enough inclusionary housing. There's not been enough set aside. There's this notion, I promise closing with this, that if you build the luxury stuff, they will come. If you build the higher stuff, people will vacate, and then there'll be room for all the people that are struggling. It's BS.
Yeah. By the way, State Representative Tony Cabral has joined us now. Welcome, Tony. We're very fortunate to have you. Just by way of explanation, I did not invite the suburban legislators who represent the city. We'll have them on to discuss this issue at another time. I just felt that beyond 5, it was going to be, no one would have much time to get their points of view across. And the suburbs, of course, come at this from a little different perspective than the cities. Mark, of course, represents both the suburbs and the cities, but he's the only state senator for Greater New Bedford. So we get him in both ways.
I like to keep it that way.
Tony, how big a problem in the city is landlord speculation, whether it has to do with the coming train or not? And is there anything in this $5.1 billion bond bill that tries to address that?
Well, I'm sure there is some landlord speculation. We can see it going on. This happened not only this time around, but also happened, as you remember, just before the housing crisis in 2008, 2009. We had a spike in prices of housing, and then that sort of that bubble burst, and we're seeing that right now as well. But I think what we need to do is really build additional units into the market in order to begin to tackle those high rents that we are beginning to see in New Bedford. I mean, I have office hours, as you may know, Jack, every Saturday of every month, and over the last 8-9 months, the primary reason they come and see me at office hours is issues with housing. I had an elderly or an older woman that came to my office hours a few months back who worked all her life. She's retired. She lives on on an apartment of one of the 3 deckers in the South End, and she was paying obviously $600 of rent a month, and the house got turned over, got sold, and the new landlord said to her, "Your rent is going to be $1,400." And wow. And you know what? The sad part here is her Social Security check that she gets every month is exactly $1,400. So how do you resolve this issue? How do you help someone in that situation? They worked all her life in mostly in the factories, in New Bedford, and now finds herself potentially homeless, right? So how to resolve those? So I think it's by creating additional units, more units on the market, and there's by building. We have to build. We have to build. We have to also create incentives for owner-occupied landlords to invest in their own properties, to rehab that second floor or third floor to today's standards and today's amenities. That there's a lot of those so-called offline units in New Bedford because younger couples and so forth, they're looking for all the new things, right? And a lot of these apartments on these 2 and 3 families are not up to those standards. So I think that's an area that we have to look at as well, in addition to building new housing. In this bond bill, the 5.1 billion that we all keep talking about, there are some really, really good stuff in there, both for the statewide and locally. I mean, and I have to put my reading glasses in order to give you that.
Why don't you look that up, Tony, and have it ready to go, and we'll get back to you.
All right, go right ahead.
I don't want to waste time.
No, it's right in front of me. It's right
It's right in front of you. Okay, then go ahead. My bad.
No, go ahead. Move on to Chris, and we'll come back.
No, go ahead. Just
battle one of those things, and I know probably the city might disagree with me on this. I think we do need inclusionary zoning in New Bedford. I mean, there was arguments that we don't need it because the majority, we already had 10% or more of affordable housing. But what that will do is what it did in the city of Salem, which is every development, be affordable, non-affordable, or market rate, would have to have 10% of those units being affordable units. And that's what's happening right now in Salem for quite a while, including the HTIP program, which is market rate. And yes, potentially you can have up to 20% of affordable. Most developers, because of the finance gap, sort of forego that potential 20% because it's not mandatory. But in Salem, they have to at least have 10%, if not 20. So I think that's an important tool to probably the term forcing developers to do that is probably not a good term, but at least understanding that if you're going to develop, you're going to have a housing project, a housing development in New Bedford, if you have inclusionary zone, be 10% or otherwise, those units have to be in that project. So,
and that's a local option?
Yes, that's a local zoning option.
Okay.
And that was established in Salem under the Lieutenant Governor of Kim Driscoll when she was the mayor of Salem.
Okay. Has the city adopted that yet? Josh?
I believe not, and I'll leave that up to Josh and the mayor to talk about that. But that's something that I believe strongly, that I think that's a good tool, even though we believe in New Bedford, or some folks in New Bedford believe that we already have enough subsidized housing. We already have enough public housing. We are way over the 10% affordability in that sense. But I think it is a tool that going forward on the new construction, that would at least give us some level of additional affordable units in the city.
Okay. But by the way, before we go to Josh, we did invite Mayor John Mitchell. He declined to take part, but he sent Josh Marshall, Josh Amaral, which is the next best thing. Some might even say a better thing. So, Josh, do we have this kind of 10% provision in the city?
Yeah, well, first, Jack, I want to say Mayor Mitchell sends his best to everyone on the call today and regrets he wasn't able to participate, but I'm glad to be here and representing the administration in this all-important discussion about housing, which our office, thankfully has been deeply engaged on. To the point of inclusionary zoning, I think our approach is that, if our development market, our real estate market, were as hot as Salem's, I believe Salem has the 4th hottest real estate market in the country. We might be might have a different perspective on that, but the reality is here that there are significant impediments to development in terms of, the financial gap on projects that really require additional financial resources to work. So our office has really been on the forefront of working with developers to piece the financing sources each project needs together. Most of the most visible developments that you see, like up here along Union Street, are predominantly income restricted units, meaning not just 10% are set aside for low-income folks, but in some cases, 100% of those units are. With the Upper Union Street project, the Middle Union Street project is nearly 100%. And then the one on the corner of Union and Route 18 has 5 units out of 28 that are set aside. The reality is most major projects, larger projects like that, require some affordable units just because the funding is necessary to make that happen. So in order to apply and leverage some of the state programs that exist, you're basically committing to setting aside units for low to moderate income residents. We don't think that it should be sort of a one-size-fits-all model, and we don't think that it's the right time for us to force developers on any given project to set aside 10% of their units or something like that, as has been done in other communities. It may make perfect sense in those places where developers basically subsidize those units themselves, right? They reduce their profit margins. The reality is, for us, a great number of the projects that we evaluate don't pencil out, meaning there is no profit to be made. They don't make sense to move forward. Banks won't lend to them. And so each one has to be considered on a case-by-case basis. It is true, New Bedford's at nearly 13% of its housing stock is set aside for low-income folks. Closer to 30% of our units are actually subsidized in some way when you consider vouchers, Section 8 vouchers and things like that. So I think 1 in every 3 rental units you see in the city is occupied by a low to moderate income person in an income restricted unit in some capacity. We look at the towns around us, none of them are at the 10% requirement for the 40B law and would probably benefit from some of that inclusionary zoning and from more multifamily development in general. And so, hearing Senator Montigny's comments earlier about NIMBYism and how that impacts things, we certainly want to see more development across our whole region. We're doing everything we can in New Bedford, and you can hear me on this. There's going to be a lot more low and moderate income units developed alongside units for folks that are just above those income levels, which I think are also the folks that are showing up to the office hours and the constituent service meetings looking for a place, right? They might make more than, $40,000 a year, but they don't make enough to afford, top of the market rents. They certainly don't make enough to qualify for a mortgage in this hot single family market. And so they're in a bit of a bind where none of the income restricted units or the inclusionary zoning type units would be available to them because they make too much, and yet they're still struggling to put food on the table and pay their rent every month. So we need to develop at all segments of the market, and that's what we're committed to doing.
It's just a small point, possibly of correction. I thought Dartmouth had reached their 10% level.
No, I don't believe so.
Okay.
I think they're fairly close. They have some 200 some odd unit development in progress. I think they'll still be well short of the 10%, but they're certainly further along than they are going east, where Marion, Mattapoisett, Rochester are, I believe, below 5%, in some cases below 2%.
Jack, if I may, I think we can be, it's a great goal to encourage the surrounding communities to meet the standard of 10%, but we've been talking about this for generations, right? I think let's talk about New Bedford. That's how can we impact and change in New Bedford. I can't go to Mattapoisett and Marion or Dartmouth and try to make them comply or at least to encourage them. That's not my role. I think it's the role of those who live and represent those communities in particular and live there, and I elected there. We can encourage, but I think we can't. I think counting on the region to create, the region meaning the greater New Bedford, to create more affordability, I think it's just like, I don't know, I think it's just spinning our wheels. I think we need to really focus in New Bedford.
Okay, Representative Hendricks, I apologize because I'm anxious to talk to you because you're the guy that probably has the biggest crisis in your district. But I want to go over to Senator Montigny just for a second, bouncing off of what Tony just said, because you are the guy who does represent the suburbs. And the mayor has made a big deal out of the suburbs and not doing this year. Josh just alluded to it. What's your take on that?
Well, obviously I have not really a different take than Tony, but a different demographic because I've got the whole city and the 4 towns around. And I would say, first of all, that Tony's right, that we've had this Chapter 40B for decades, and some of the biggest complainers are the biggest violators. Again, I happened to cite this story in Commonwealth Magazine because I thought it was the height of hypocrisy of a person who was running for office as a liberal. And like on his sleeve that he was saving the world, and here we were having an investigation that he was killing projects. So I don't think it's acceptable. I think communities that have not been able to get to 10% after decades and still complain. And by the way, there's a real effort. I can remember one of my Senate colleagues who's since left and run for mayor of his community on the South Shore, complaining about 40B and every year in the budget trying to kill 40B. And I'd get up and question him and say, what's the percentage of affordable housing? Because when your people can't afford it, they are looking elsewhere, and we're having trouble just taking care of the people that are here with a shortage. So if everyone took care of their own, including in the towns that I represent, and everyone approached that 10%, I think Dartmouth actually is working aggressively to get there. We wouldn't have the problem that we have. So I think those that have complained at the city level are right, but also those that say we, meaning everyone else other than me at this table, that are focused solely on the city, have a right to say we have to do with what we have. But let me close by saying one of the things we can do, both with cities and towns that are below the 10%, as well as with private developers, if you want state resources for housing and you are not aggressively approaching those standards, then you should not get prioritized for that. So when Dartmouth came to me recently, and I earmarked $500,000 in this bond for the veterans housing out on Route 6. They showed me a plan, an aggressive plan to try to do some affordable housing. I will support them. If I remember a situation where I got a call from someone that was trying to do a project in Marion, and I didn't represent Marion at the time, but I was incensed about the town trying to kill a 40B project, which actually the folks that were proponents prevailed. But one of the reasons in this bond that we have done things to supersede local zoning is because it got so myopic that it was preventing the Commonwealth from being a living place. And that's when the Commonwealth should supersede. But it's very controversial, very difficult. We still have a tradition, this old Puritan tradition of home rule, but it's gone to an extreme. We live in a community. We live in a Commonwealth with 351 communities. And if some are bearing more of the burden than others, and I'll close with this. I was in the New Bedford Family Shelter one year, and I was stunned. I went there with joy. It was amazing. These were young women that were bringing up little children, and there wasn't sadness. It was around Christmas time. We were bringing them gifts. And I was thinking, it must be wonderful. Hopefully you won't be in the shelter in the spring, but I hope you'll stay here. We have beautiful beaches. And I just innocently said to people, how many of you were born here? Not one. And to a person, Audra was with me, so this is not just anecdotes that I'm making up as I go along. To a person, they said things like, I would have preferred to stay in my community where my grandmother was helping take care of my child while I was working, or where I could get transportation, or my church was providing resources. So when we end up as a community taking on more of a burden than our social service structure and our housing structure can handle, it's not really fair to the people that we're receiving, and it's not really fair for the people who can't afford to pay rent.
Representative Hendricks, your new district, as the boundaries have been redrawn since the last census, correct me if I'm wrong, it consists almost entirely of multifamily neighborhoods.
For the most part, yes.
Of multifamily units, and
Just parts of Ward 2 are the exception, but by and large, yes.
So you have two things there. You have a large number of people who are renters who I've seen in my own neighborhood in just a few years, rents go from $900 to $1,500 just for the same apartment in a couple of years. On the other hand, you have out-of-town landlords versus mom and pop landlords who are just trying to make a living, and they're subject to inflation like the rest of us. We had a rent stabilization proposal that went down in flames before the city council after the state allowed local communities to do it. The city is doing hundreds of units a year, but the city's own study shows that they need 7,000 units. Is it time to take a second look at rent stabilization in the city, or what are your thoughts on how to address this problem that seems to be almost more in crisis in your neighborhoods than anybody's?
Right. Yeah. So relative to the rent stabilization, I've always been on the record saying that I would be, for some form of rent control, some form of cap on increases in periodic rents. I don't know if it's as low as 5, which is a number you hear a lot, but I certainly would be open to something that caps rents, from 10 to 12 to 15 in that range. Other tenant protections that I've gone on the record talking about multiple times, upfront costs, which I think was included in one of the versions of the housing bond bill. With brokerage fees and transferring those onto the landlord instead of the tenant. Those would go a long way, but protections like that, housing court, attorney representation, adequate representation, perhaps free representation in housing court. So given, as you said, Jack, given the nature of my district, I've been focusing a lot on those types of fixes that would really have direct advantages to renters, and especially low-income renters. This housing bond bill, which you saw was, I hope that it's one big step in a long process, because obviously this was a big, huge omnibus bill that was more geared toward the big picture, which is development, construction, putting numbers of units online as quickly as possible, in a little bit on substantive changes and tenant protections. Hopefully the next go around, whether it be next session or sometime soon, we'll have the opposite. We'll have something that's big on policy, big on substance, and more on development. I think that we have a numbers problem. We need 7,000 or so units in New Bedford. It's a small bandwidth compared to the statewide problem that we have, which is a little bit of a silver lining. But certainly given my district, I've been focusing on, the neighborhood level tenant protections. I have 2 MBTA communities in my district, or 2 MBTA train stations. So the MBTA Communities Act is going to play a huge role in my district, in the North End and downtown. So I'm hoping that once the city has worked that out and adopted, wholeheartedly the MBTA's Community Act, that we'll have affordable housing being built as of right in those areas near the train stations. There's a lot of talk. Again, you mentioned my district, and there's a lot of people. It's a very high density areas included in my district. So, there's a lot of issues around parking, around the logistical things of having a train station in housing. But I think that is something that we need to maintain focus on. But I think the MBTA station, Communities Act's really gonna transform New Bedford.
I want to get back. I want to get back to those MBTA districts in a minute, but before we leave this rent stabilization district, would you exempt the mom and pop landlords?
Yes, I think the original legislation that I've always co-sponsored, I think it was Mike Conley, and at some point Nika Elaguardo, who's now gone, but they have an exception for owner-occupied units that are under like 6 units, I believe. But I would absolutely, and that would help gentrification. You want to keep people. A lot of my residents, I'm sure everyone's constituents are getting little postcards with a picture of their house saying, we're making you offer today. We'll give you $500,000 for your, apartment. That's what fuels gentrification. We have to incentivize folks to stay here and thrive in the community without, being subject to big companies coming in and gentrifying the whole place.
I get those offers from my little house all the time, but not quite $500,000. I want to go to Mark. You're the one guy here in the panel that represents all the same neighborhoods as Chris, but much more, of course. Where do you come down on rent stabilization? What's your thoughts on that?
First, if I can pick up right where the gentrification that Chris mentioned, because there's 2 things that we haven't talked about. First, and as you know, Jack, I did a lot of the early commuter rail work, the bonding and the language and the enabling. Anything we do in the legislature in bonding, even including in this housing bond, of course, we authorize and the governor has to expend. So it wasn't until Charlie Baker supported us on it that we moved forward. But I can remember being with Deval Patrick at the Whaler Museum, and a reporter, and I think it might have been you, actually said to me something, you know, you've been at this a long time. You always were the #1 cheerleader for it, and you seem to be rather reserved and not cheerleading as much. And I'm paraphrasing. And again, if it wasn't you, then I wish I could give proper attribution. But there were two reasons at the time that I mentioned. One, I got sick and tired of governors holding press conferences and then doing nothing. And two, the $5 billion bond needed to be done years ago in conjunction, not now as we're getting ready. I mean, I'm very proud of my work on commuter rail, but also very concerned. Sometimes it's be careful what you wish for if all of the infrastructure isn't in place. The second thing on gentrification, we reward the city of Boston that sold their complete soul in the financial district. So if you work for the biotech industry and you come in from another country, or if you're lucky, like the few that live there that were born here, that buy $2 and $3 million condos, they're not in my reference of the people I grew up with and the people I represent, the people I hang out with. And yet that forces gentrification everywhere else in the state because it's so unaffordable there that they come to places where they're making the salary there, but buying the property here. And the people that live here, many born here, many new arrivals, can't afford it. So it's deeply troubling. I'm very skeptical. I want to call it what it is. If somebody shows me, particularly a local home rule on reasonable rent stabilization with the backup of actually it working somewhere, I'm always open. But let's call the more extreme provisions what it is, rent control. And no, I don't see any examples of rent control working well. On the other hand, something needs to be done, but it needs to be done very reasonably. You have to be respectful, especially of the small landlords. I mean, there are people in this community who have been here for a long time that have 2 units, 3 units, 4 units. I don't resent them if they have 10 and 12 units. I am concerned when somebody comes in from out of town and just buys things up and doesn't fix them and, you know, doubles and triples the rent. I don't know what the solution is. I have to tell you that if I was a hard no on any kind of local home rule, I would say it here and take the consequences. I'm struggling with it.
Josh, the mayor, of course, vetoed the rent stabilization proposal. And as long as I've known him, as well as the people he deals with around the city on housing, he has stressed that New Bedford needs more market rate housing. You alluded to it a few minutes ago when you said that the city had upwards of a 1/3 of people one way or another who are in subsidized units. I'm not going to ask about
can I say one more thing just as part of what you're saying to Josh, because it would help me. I don't think there's a 2% chance that statewide rent control policy will take place. So what you're asking, Josh, is hugely important. Even for consideration, it's got to be solved at the local level and then brought to the legislature.
Interesting.
I think anybody who's saying that rent control will be voted on a statewide level without local control is naive or just not telling you the truth.
Yeah, I actually wasn't going to ask Josh again about rent stabilization. The mayor's position is clear. What I was going to ask is he has stressed the need for more market housing. The theory is that if you get the market rate housing, some of the overpriced lower level housing will lower their prices. I'll believe that when I see it, but I understand the theory. My question is, I understand the mayor's logic in wanting to diversify New Bedford as a community that is demographically mixed and all, although there are some legitimate issues of gentrification. But everybody I talk to says that the proposals that come before the city, especially with all these statewide grants and federal grants around, want to have a large component of affordable units. And so I think that we have one going in on Union Street on the what I always call it, what a lot of people call the hole on Union Street, where the Keystone building used to be. That's going to be entirely market rate. So how do you know what is the line between market rate and affordable units in a city that's in a housing crisis?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, Jack, and I think it's important to talk about sort of definitions, right? So, as housing policy has hit the mainstream and we all talk about it, being that it's such an important issue, I think a lot gets lost in translation. So when most people hear affordable housing, they interpret that as housing I can afford, right? Which is certainly reasonable. And yet in sort of housing parlance, right, that typically refers to housing that is restricted for those that are at 60% of the area median income or less. And so what is considered like affordable with a capital A housing varies in every community based on what that community's sort of median income is. And so in New Bedford, the median income is raised in the last few years, but it's by and large fairly low, right? Compared to that of Greater Boston, it is like half. And so we have this challenge where if all you build are units that are restricted to those that are at 60% area median income or below, then the new units can only be occupied by folks that are making $40,000, $50,000 a year or less. And yet we have a huge renter population in the city that make between $40,000 and $50,000 and say $60,000 or $70,000. And so if we're not working with developers to make sure that we're getting units online at all levels, we're failing the residents of the city. And so people hear market rate. I think market rate has gotten the opposite sort of perception now, right? Market rate has this connotation of like luxury units, but I don't think that's the case. Certainly not with the market rate housing that's being built in New Bedford, which is fairly limited, by the way. The market rate units here should simply be understood as unrestricted, right? Anybody can rent them. They're still subject to what the rents are on the market. We're seeing those these days in the range of $1,600, $1,700 a month, which is certainly a lot more than they were 5 or 10 years ago. But on the market today, those are opportunities people are scooping up. Downtown, right? You talked about Union Street. You mentioned the Keystone site. 20% of the units in that project will be income restricted. They'll be restricted at a slightly higher level. It'll be closer to 100% area median income rather than 60%. So it'll catch more sort of workforce folks, and we like to see that. And that's, I think, a good project. But the other units along Union Street, as I mentioned earlier, are almost entirely income restricted below 60% AMI. So there's a perception that
not all of them. Not all of them. 18 in Union is large.
correct. Yes. So predominantly that project is market rate, but 5 of those units are set aside for below 60%. 1 is set aside for below 50% within those. So you're looking at 125 or so units along there, and 100 of them are income restricted. So I don't know. The perception is that I think because you see new buildings and they're great looking, and they'll contribute nicely, that people perceive them to be like luxury condos that are going to be $2,500 a month or whatever the case may be. But the reality is those are going to be units that are occupied by, everyday working folks and seniors on fixed incomes and things like that, just like anywhere else. However, we still have a gap, right? You alluded earlier to the study that was done by Mass Inc. Regarding New Bedford's housing market, and that found that the biggest gap in units are in the middle income and above range, that we've sort of reached a threshold to some degree in units that are restricted below those levels, and we need to add them higher. The problem is there's no real market incentive to build them. It is largely more lucrative to build lower income housing than it is to build middle income housing. And so we have to work with developers to make sure that they're addressing all of our market needs, or New Bedford renters that are, working people, they're getting off the clock now and into us here on the chat, have a hard time finding a place to live. And so we got to do it at all levels. That's very clear. And so whether it's adding units at the top of the market, the middle, or below, we need to build all forms of housing. In our housing plan, Building New Bedford, we articulated a preference for a split of the new units we generate to be 60% market rate or more, and for the 40% to be income restricted as needed. That allows us to compete for all the grant programs, bring in all the capital that we possibly can to assist in these projects that is certainly needed, but also, pays some credence to the fact that we need to develop at all levels. And so we work with developers to do that. Almost every project that I'm talking to developers about, and we've got approximately 900 units in discussion in some point in that pipeline. Virtually every one of those project has a mixed income component of some degree, and they need to, or else they don't make financial sense to do. So we're deep in the weeds. I spend a lot more time in spreadsheets than I thought when I signed up for this job.
All right. Tony, I want to go to you. You also have a lot of multifamily neighborhoods in the Peninsula area, the Goulart Square area, that you've represented for a long time. You've been dealing with housing issues for a long time. Where do you come down on the issue of rent stabilization, and what would you like to see as housing policy in the city so that we can get closer to critical mass rather than, building hundreds when we need thousands of units?
Well, I mean, rent stabilization is just a new term for rent control. And as Mark mentioned, right now, you can't establish, it's not a statewide program. It's a community by community. They would have to do a home rule. and submit that to the legislature. And I don't think there is enough votes in the legislature to pass any one of those. Call them rent stabilization, call them rent control. I think Mark is right on that. And so I think what we need to do is really to create the sort of opportunities for people to invest and rehab their own properties, as I said earlier. For example, the housing bond bill, the $5.1 billion, we were able to include, working with Josh and Josh's office, we were able to include a couple of earmarks that I think are very important. One would create a small developer Go fund just for New Bedford at $1.5 million. And one would create a conversion from commercial to residential. Again, another fund specifically for New Bedford, started with $1.5 million. And I think those are specific. That would be specific with New Bedford, but those are important programs. You have a lot of small developers, right? Someone who might buy a three-decker or a six-family or a four-family unit, and they need that kind of incentive as well to bring those apartments back online. Also, public housing per se, we do have, over about $2 billion on that bond bill that would provide the kind of funding that housing authorities really need to rehab a lot of their units. I don't know exactly how many units right now, but I know there are, from time to time, there are quite a number of units that are offline that are administered or managed by the housing authority, because, especially on the state side, not the federal side, because you have two kinds of housing that are controlled or managed by the housing authority, both what's called so-called federal housing or federal building, as they might commonly refer to it. But up until now, we've had very little state investment to actually go at all of those housing developments, so all those units, and bring them all online. It's a shame that some of them are offline. They can't be rented. They're not in any condition. And up to now, we didn't have the kind of funds to do that. But I really like the idea of really going at the small developer, right? And small developers could be a mom and pop, right? I have a 3-family or 6-family. I might live on one of those units, and I need to invest or reinvest in that property in order to be able then to rent those, bring a lot of those units online. And even in the city, you do have, in New Bedford, 3 families and others that the landlord might live there because they live usually on the first floor, and they're not even renting the second and the third. And Josh is aware of that. When he was at Pace, they were trying to do some good work in that area. So we need to look at that. And that's how we're going to help those areas around Glot Square, those areas around that whole area from River Street all the way down to Cove Road, between County and Craper, for example, between Bolton and Dartmouth Street. Those are beautiful areas that can be brought online. A lot of those units that presently they're not online.
Jack, I think oftentimes it's first calling out the BS and then finding the balance, and we haven't done that. And here's what I mean. So I go back to Boston again, because a lot of the gentrification happening statewide is because Boston crowded out people with such an expense that even people that can afford far more than most of those I represent can come here and have their pick and choose, but it prices out the people who are trying to stay here. The first goal is we should be keeping people in their home. One of my proudest moments this year was passing home equity theft. Can you imagine cities and towns and private firms stealing the equity after pushing somebody out of their home, and their government appointed or elected officials? There were appointed officials in New Bedford and statewide defending the practice of stealing somebody's equity. We put a stop to it. But in the subsidization of developments, we should be much higher on scrutiny. And I have to say that Chris and Tony and I, who, by the way, worked very closely together on this bond, earmarked a bunch of stuff at the request of Josh and others. But we get requests. I mean, Audra Riding, who's off the screen to my right, who does some of my best work as a talented lawyer, when she comes to me and says, so-and-so requested a support letter because he or she are trying to develop something in New Bedford. This is a real story, and it happens frequently. The first thing I say to her is, just tell me how many units are affordable and what kind of set aside and what kind of commitment there is, or the letter's not going out. You want to build luxury housing? I'm all for it. I want to see the top to the bottom in New Bedford. I'm just not going to take taxpayer money and subsidize you. Go away. Go build it on your own. Build it at, the high end of the market. I think it's wonderful. But most of the people I represent can't afford it and don't belong getting the support for it. Now, it's different when it comes to mixed income and levels below that. I do think we need that healthy mix. Close with this. We also have bonds like the $1 billion in 10 years we've given to the biotech industry. What does that have to do with housing? Well, first of all, we shouldn't do it. We take taxpayer money and put it on the balance sheet of some of the wealthiest companies in the country. Most people on Beacon Hill are clueless about economic development, frankly, maybe for another discussion. But how does that affect housing? Because all of that government money that was developed in Boston created the $2 and $3 million condo market with all kinds of infrastructure paid by taxpayers, including people in New Bedford. It shouldn't be allowed. It's easy for me to vote against it, but voting against it doesn't kill it.
Jack, may I say something about?
Go ahead, Chris.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Because Tony mentioned, the states, the New Bedford, the housing authorities across the state, and it's a great point, because that is probably when it comes to low income renters who need affordable housing, the state's public housing system has been a wreck. That's for a number of reasons. It's for lack of funding. It's not because of the people there aren't working their rear ends off, because they are. It's because of the centralized waitlist system, administrative issues, resources, staffing. In this, like Tony said, this bill puts over $2 billion towards closing those gaps for that specific reason. It empowers. I'm glad this bill was passed, because what it does is it empowers local housing authorities, which they haven't been able to do. We've had about, in Tony, the figure you were looking for, I think, is about 23 to 2,500 units that sit vacant in right. municipalities' housing authorities. Because they don't have the money, they don't have the resources to keep them up to date, and sometimes they're even converting them to office space because they don't have, the resources. So this will close a lot of that financial gap.
That 2,300 number is across the state, right?
Across the state, right? But the conversations I've had with Josh and Steve Beauregard, it's really bad in New Bedford, and so which is one of the reasons why as far as my earmarks, I got 500 for the Nashmont development, so they can do their roof and shingling, but 500 for another 500 for utility upgrades across New Bedford housing, citywide. So again, empowering the public housing system. And, Massachusetts is only one of 5 states that has one of these systems. A lot of people forget that. So it's an innovative thing that we've kind of we haven't put proper attention over the last several years. So this bill really addresses that, which I think is going to be a huge thing over the next several years. You'll see that.
Jack, I think Chris is being kind. It's not several years, it's several decades.
He's young, Tony.
But believe me, that, as I said earlier in this, Chris emphasized again, that's going to really make a big difference as well, because, in New Bedford, we have quite a number of those units offline as well, and they've never had the resources to really put them on, make what needed to be rehabbed and fixed and put them online again for people to live in. But if I go quickly back to the so-called rental stabilization, I think what's best, what we need to, I think probably deserves a second look, is really the real estate transfer fees or taxes, call it what you want. And I'm looking, a second look for me would not be the way the governor proposed it, be a local option and be locally controlled. I think I would rather see a statewide program, a statewide approach to that, with a fund that the state then can make decisions to help those communities that need the most, and not have this local option kind of thing, because I think it doesn't really work. For us in New Bedford, for example, how many $1 million plus properties happens to be sold in New Bedford? So I don't think we would benefit from that necessarily that much. So I would like to take a second look. But again, as I said, let's look at the statewide level and see what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what kind of fund could be established with that, and how much really that would produce as well in terms of resources.
Jack, one really important piece of policy that we haven't touched on, I'm surprised, because it's sometimes the things that are the most unjust, like home equity theft, you want to talk about. No fault evictions. Everybody on this call worked on it. The Senate language ultimately prevailed, but not without the help of Chris and Josh and Tony. Basically, think about the outrage of being displaced from your apartment, which you are evicted in a sense, right? There's no fault. You're gone. The developer decides to do what they're going to do. And somehow it ends up on your record you were evicted. I mean, it's another example of the big guy works out just fine and the little guy gets screwed, and we changed it and closed it. The fact that we're talking about it in 2024 is troubling to me, but think about it. It's one thing if you're evicted because you don't pay rent. And even then, I think we should be very, very careful putting a scarlet letter on people for years. But this says that if you are displaced through no fault of your own, you have paid your rent, you certainly shouldn't have any consumer report that says you got evicted.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with the home equity theft legislation. I will point out, though, in the interest of fairness, and we don't have time because I want to go to homelessness for a second before we wrap up. But at the time that those stories broke, and it was the New Bedford Light that investigated. Ari Sky, the former chief financial officer of the city, pointed out that when people are in foreclosure and don't pay their taxes, it's the rest of the taxpayers.
No, Jack, no, sorry. I'm going to go right. I wish Ari Sky were on the call because we'd have a great debate. Here's the bottom line. First of all, people should be kept in their home. There are rare instances where they cannot be, right? But in almost every case that we saw, and this is why the Supreme Court took what we said was immoral and said it's unconstitutional. This is what the city and others were doing. They were selling off this right to a private law firm, well-connected, that was actually paying, the light exposed it, paying for seminars of tax collectors. It was as bad as politicians get accused of when they're in collusion and cavorting with lobbyists. There is no excuse at all. There were people in this city and across this Commonwealth and across the country that had $200,000 in equity. They had mental illness, or they were in a nursing home, or they were physically ill. They're wrong. Anybody advocating for it is simply wrong.
You're not saying that when people don't pay their taxes,
no,
taxpayers have to pay
my law, because it's not a bill or a thought or an argument anymore. It's a law. You have to pay all of the taxes and all of the reasonable fees, but the government doesn't get to steal $200,000.
I'm talking about the interim, because the levy. Well, we're getting into the weeds here, but the levy is the levy, and every year it has to.
No, but they could have collected just the fees and the taxes and gone through the foreclosure and returned the money like many communities were. And to make the argument it was helping other taxpayers, Jack, you have to understand, in almost every case, the city or town was selling it to Tallage, the law firm, and all of the equity was going to Tallage, and the city was getting peanuts. Total shiny object waving in front of the voter.
Yeah, Josh, do you want to respond to any of this? Because it was the administration that has been criticized for engaging in this. I know
I'm criticizing statewide. I'm not picking on one or the other. You mentioned Ari Sky. That's my response.
No, I'm just saying that there are two sides to any issue.
On this one, the Supreme Court and I agree.
No, don't act like I'm saying that it's okay to take money from people, who have equity in their buildings. I'm not.
No, Jack, I'm not saying you are. I understand exactly what you're saying. I'm saying
I'm simply saying that the levy is the levy, and the money that has to be raised is the money that has to be raised. And if people aren't paying their taxes, somebody else has to pay it. That's all I'm saying.
Well, so before, during, and now after in this law, it absolutely still allows the city or town to foreclose, although we try really hard not to. We give them the incentive not to. And all of the money has to be given to the city or town that's owed. It's just the equity. Yeah. And Jack, in no way am I suggesting you were taking that side on. The Light covered this more closely, even than the Boston media that I worked with very closely.
Absolutely.
So, kudos to the reporter, Grace, and others who have covered it.
I'll jump in quickly and just to add, it's been close to 5 years since the city has sold a tax lien to any outside entity. We put a stop to that practice. Would generally agree with the idea that no one should lose the equity in their home. and that, we should be flexible in working with folks and trying to keep them in their homes, work with them, and be reasonable. And I think it's certainly fair for people to have equity returned to them. At the same time, we have to balance that with the need for properties to, for everything to be fair for the taxpayer. You're right, Jack. The other taxpayers in the city shouldn't be burdened with someone else that's choosing not to pay. Likewise, even with our vacant property initiative that we've started up in the last year or so, tax title and foreclosure is an unfortunate reality of vacant and abandoned property, that we do have to use those tools at times to ensure neighborhood stability and ensure that someone else can live in those homes that otherwise would be stuck in the market. So we're evaluating the new legislation. Our treasurer is looking at that and working with their staff to make sure that we can implement that properly. In general, we've taken an approach with our vacant property initiative to work with folks that own vacant property, that look at tax delinquent property and consider different scenarios to make sure things come out fairly with them. And we studied the bill, and we'll continue to implement that and look for solutions that make sense for everyone.
Yeah, it's a law. It's a law.
Yeah,
my
sorry.
question's more of Mass Municipal, Jack and Josh. I disagree with nothing Josh just said. But Mass Municipal, right up until the governor signed my law, was fighting us, and they were not fair, in my opinion. And I work with them very closely and respect their work, not on this one. I agree to disagree.
I think it's a good law. With your intelligence, guys, I want to spend about 10 minutes, and then we'll end up. I could talk to you all days. I hope you'll come back, because this is the issue of the year right now, this housing crisis. But we also have a homelessness crisis, not just in New Bedford, but everywhere. I've lived here 25 years, and I was shocked. And again, this is the New Bedford Lights reporting, to the extent of the homelessness in woods and fields and just sort of any nondescript area, that is not developed in the city. And we know Councilor Burgo came up with a proposal backed by United Interfaith Action, a group whom I know you all respect, of religious people, to have the city try to formalize a role in addressing the problems. It's a very controversial idea, but to have all these people living in woods and encampments across the city, and every single ward has one, is just astonishing. This is a new development in American society, not just in New Bedford. And I know there's $326 million in the state legislation this year for emergency relief, I believe it is. But tell me what your thoughts are, particularly. We'll do a round robin, and if you can go like for 2 or 3 minutes about what we do to address this homelessness crisis. Mark?
If you don't mind, I'd love to hear from Josh first, just because I think the city is well, I mean, I can give you an opinion. I think the city's actually working on an actual reaction to a city council proposal. It's going to be decided at the city level, not at the state level.
Fair enough. Go first, Josh.
I'll kick it off, Jack. So we've seen these trends, right? It is not a total shock that in a time of a housing crisis that you would also see an uptick in homelessness. That's been the case across the country. So just as our housing crisis spreads, throughout the East Coast, really throughout most of America, similar to that has been the growth in this homeless crisis. Our office sort of administers and works closely with the longstanding homeless service providers network that you all know well, and work with all the community agencies that participate in that. About a year ago, together, we embarked on a project where Mayor Mitchell allocated ARPA funds for us to go out and hire a group called the Technical Assistance Collaborative, and they are the gold standard in sort of homeless service provision in the country. And they've come in and they've spent much of the last year analyzing our system, looking at what we do well, where we need to grow, where we need to develop our workforce, where there are certain key investments needed in order for us to respond to the growing challenge of homelessness. And so we are anticipating the release of their plan, their report with recommendations for us to implement very soon. However, it is to some degree the prescriptions that they will give us are not a total surprise, right? It likely involves more housing being built in the city, both at affordable rates and otherwise. It may involve expanded services, building capacity of our service providers, permanent supportive housing, day center perhaps, and other things that other communities are doing to grapple with these crises just as well. We look at that problem today. It is larger than it's been. Some of it ties back to shelter policy. Some of it ties back to the availability of beds in these programs. Some of it's a larger mental health concern. It's a very complicated issue. When you think about, like, for example, one site in the city, this was just told to me the other day by someone who's, actively conducts outreach among the homeless population in the city, said, the idea of putting everybody together in one place has failed in most places, but it's unlikely to proceed in New Bedford because there are folks don't necessarily agree with each other. There's a reason why people are spread throughout the city in different parts of town, and they don't interact well. They don't stay with each other well and participate in one, like, sort of communal setting, right? So there's a reason for it. You mentioned that there's sort of encampments in every ward. I believe that data refers to, like, anywhere someone is set up. So, encampment sort of indicates like a tent camp full of a bunch of people, but in some cases it might be like one person, one tent. So we want to do more of that. We got to expand our outreach. We've gotten better about using data, and we'll continue to expand those tools so that people out in the field doing outreach are keeping live sort of tally where folks are, and we're able to coordinate our resources rather than duplicating our resources. And just as important is looking at our homeless service provider agencies, right? They've had huge workforce challenges, hard to hire people. The pay rates are too low. There's large turnover and churn in those professions. We don't necessarily see frontline and sort of middle managers reaching leadership positions in those agencies, which also is a concern. So we're looking at all of those things. We need our service provision to be better. We need additional investment in that area. And the city's been really committed to that. It's been important to us to get this outside expertise from someone who can come in and analyze our system objectively. Otherwise, it's just on us and our sort of local friends to analyze the situation and tell us what's needed. And, invariably, if you see things through, combating substance use lens, you think that the prescription is more programs and services in that area. If you think it's combating food insecurity, on the other hand, then you think we need more food to be provided to folks. We needed an outside expert to come in and look at our system and tell us where there are gaps and how we can best address them. And so we're eager to get about responding to that and getting into that work here in the fall. And we'll be going at it really hard.
Yeah, the only thing I would say to that is that it does seem like this is a long-range plan, and this is an emergency problem with the numbers we're seeing in these encampments. I have a question from Carl Alves, who you all know over at PACE, and he wants to know, are there funding opportunities for funding alternative housing models, such as congregate housing, tiny home communities, et cetera? In other words, some sort of different types of housing that would put homeless people in a house, but not a traditional apartment or home as we know it. Anybody can answer that. When it's
Yeah, we do have something in the housing bond bill, about 200 million that is devoted to that exact type of innovation that Carl referenced, innovation and alternative forms of housing, like single person occupancy units, SROs, transitional housing specifically for homeless folks.
Right.
That's a little bit of a policy, assigning money to that type of innovation, I think is one of those things we have to think outside the box on. And I'm glad we got it through. So we do have some money devoted to that specifically in the housing bond bill.
But
Tony.
Yeah, we do, and I'm glad Chris pointed it out. But I think, how do we really, in the long term, address some of the issue of homelessness with the homeless? I think it's a three-pronged approach, right? You need additional housing, as Josh mentioned, additional units, and to get creative and innovative with this money that is in the housing bond bill. But I think we need to also two other things. I think we need to minimize evictions to begin with. And a couple of years back, we met, myself and part of the delegation, we met with the housing clerk, magistrate, and the administrative judge that oversees all housing courts in Massachusetts, right, in the Commonwealth, for two things. One, and I think Chris mentioned earlier, we need to have a way to find representation for the tenants when they go to the housing court. Right now, hardly any, if any, really have representation. And the landlords, they all have a lawyer there with them. Second, it's important for the housing court to provide the necessary information to those tenants when they are facing possible eviction, in the housing court system. And that's one of the discussions we had with the presiding judge, not the presiding judge, sorry, the administrative judge of the housing court, is making sure before that person, any action takes place, that person gets the necessary information of how to resolve some of those issues. We have a very successful state program called RAFT, that right now any individual family can get up to, during the pandemic was 10 million. We have sort of rolled that back a little bit. It's now 7,500 for back rent and other fees that they might face in order for them to stay at that unit that they live in or to seek another unit. And the landlords can work, and the landlords have to and can and need to participate in that process as well. So I think that's very important. Until we had that discussion locally, that was not happening at the local level. I mean, they were not getting that information. They didn't know what even some of them didn't even know that program existed. So I think that's another important piece here, and the representation that legal representation that Chris mentioned. I'm a big supporter of that. Chris is, and I know Senator Montigny is as well. So we got to make sure we continue working on those in those areas. So yeah. So I think we have some of the tools are there. We just have to make sure they're going to work for those who are facing evictions. And I get, again, I'll go back to my office hours. I've had a number of folks who are facing eviction. One of those was a couple with 2 kids. One of those kids had some disabilities, and was tough. It was tough. We finally got them an affordable apartment with obviously public subsidy, but we couldn't find it in New Bedford. They had to move. They had to move out of the city in order to be able to. But the thing is, we were able to help them. They went through the RAFT program to back pay the landlord that they had, and still the landlord was going through wanted still that eviction, right? Because they didn't want to be facing possible again that particular family having not able to continue paying the rent, right? Even though they would get the 7,500 from the state for the back rents.
Jack,
it's not an easy solution, but it's not an easy issue to really resolve. I mean, I remember the very first person in state budget that carried a line item to address the homeless issue was Michael Dukakis in 1983. His budget for
year I was born,
for FY 84, actually, right? That was the first time the state budget actually had a line item for homeless.
I want to go back to Mark to wrap up on homelessness.
Thanks, because I don't want you to think that I would avoid a tough question.
No, I know you wouldn't, but I just have a question I want to put out there for anyone who wants to answer it, even though we're out of time. And this is from Cheryl. She wants to know, why is everyone so reticent to accept rent-controlled housing? Well, Chris was not. Can't we use the bond to initially incentivize new owners to develop new rent-controlled units with the caveat that they have rent control for just 10 years? So I put that out if anybody wants to answer it, because
this gets at, Jack, this gets at sort of like the different definitions of housing, right? So, when we've discussed rent control here today, we've talked about it in the lens of a policy or law that passes that restricts the amount a landlord can increase the rent every year. What it sounds like Cheryl's referring to is basically income restricted housing, right? Development subsidies used to create units that are income restricted to certain levels, and the rents are fixed based on those income levels. And so we've discussed that kind of at length, but the reality is the best form of development, I think, in New Bedford is mixed income housing development, where you've got some set aside with low and moderate income folks units with rents that are, $1,000, $1,200, $1,300 a month. And then you've got some market rate units that are unrestricted and get at other segments of the market where people are not eligible income wise to live in the former units, but do need a place to go nonetheless. And that's just the supply and demand problem.
Yep. In all fairness, I just want to point out that Councilor Burgo's proposal is called rent stabilization, and the people who are backing it make a point that it is not your old rent control, that it is a more nuanced situation with limits on it and exemptions. Mark.
So a couple of things. First, to the question that just came in very quickly. I'm not hesitant. No one has showed me any consensus on what an actual proposal looks like, even when you have the vote in the council and the veto, it's not consensus. If you're going to have an issue, I've been very careful. So I vote in New Bedford. I pay taxes in New Bedford. I represent Dartmouth, Fairhaven, and Acushnet, Mattapoisett also. I never tell local officials what they should do. I know my role, which is that when you figure it out, let me find you money, let me write law. Now, there's some exceptions because I am a voter and taxpayer here, but I'm seen as the senator telling people what to do. And I have to say, when a city councilor or the mayor or a selectman or woman try to tell me what to do, they don't get very far. So I wasn't trying to sidestep it as much to say, I need to hear from Carl Alves. I met with David Lima recently, but he was warning us of this 10 years ago. Josh Amaral is thoughtful on this. Councilor Burgo is as thoughtful as anyone on this. The cities and the towns have to develop it. Come to Chris, Antonio, and myself and tell us, because we can fight for resources. A mayor or a select man or woman, they may say across the Commonwealth, "Oh, we can get that done." Well, if it's coming through the legislature, it's coming through a rep or a senator, or it's not getting done. So the city comes to us through people like Josh Amaral and says, "Look, we found consensus here. This is what we should do." It's the same on the latter issue. If you look at the specific question of if you use new bonding money to incentivize a developer, and then you build in rent control or rent stabilization or a cap, I'm absolutely fine with that. I think we should be using money. That's a good way of using money. But you've got to be careful if you're trying to get developers to build more units, as has been said over and over, at least from the bottom to the mixed use level. You have to make sure the numbers work, or banks won't finance the project. So I think a good use of government subsidy to ensure the developer does the right thing is to build certain units set aside, as well as to talk about rent stabilization on caps. But just to do it broadly and suggest it's going to happen statewide, I don't care whether you're an advocacy group, someone just with a good, strong opinion who likes to write or speak on it, or a rep or senator. They are fibbing to the audience if they would suggest that there's even a minority of votes. It will have to be consensus at the local level. It will have to be reasonable, because if not, in a sense, it becomes almost an eminent domain taking by government. There are developers, small communities that own limited units that are working hard to pay their bills. We want them to keep people in their homes. We want them to use accessory units. We want, and where I think that it's interesting, the second part of the question, I don't remember the person who you referred to that wrote in, but commender, because if we absolutely, on money that we subsidize developers, there should be no shame in saying you're going to set aside a certain amount and you're going to cap the rent and rent increases for a certain number of years. Again, it has to work with the bank financing, which is the majority of the project, or the bank will reject it. So we can spew all kinds of wonderful policy, but if it doesn't get financed and built, we've done no service to our constituents.
If we have inclusionary...
Quickly, Tony, because my producer's going to kill me. Just quickly, because my technical guy is going to kill me with 50 minutes over. Go ahead, Tony.
No, I'm going to say, I mean, precisely to the point that the senator was trying to make, I think if we have inclusionary zoning, I think it will actually accomplish some of that. In which developers know upfront that if they're going to develop in New Bedford, if they're going to invest in New Bedford, yes, they have to sit down with the city and they have to negotiate the percentage of whatever it might be on the inclusionary zone, and they know already upfront what that might be and how they can address that with the financing institutions that they need to support the project. So I think that would be a good thing.
And Mark, you want to address the issue of the homeless encampments?
Well, I mean, I started to, and then I kind of lost my train of thought or answering the other question. I think that it's the local community's got to tell us how we can help. It's something that's got to be developed. It's not a statewide policy. It's not going to be a statewide policy. So the thoughtfulness of people like Shane and Josh and Carl Alves and David Lima and others have to come and say, if there's financing we can help with, there's now a $5 billion bond. Kyle mentioned congregate housing. It's there. There's all kinds of money to help with shelters. I would say this, and I don't really have an opinion yet as a voter in New Bedford, not as the senator from New Bedford, on the right way. I do know it's a crisis. I think if we have to build an encampment to put everyone together that's already living in misery, I think we have failed.
Well, the encampments are there.
No,
It's
I
just
know. And what I'm saying is if
oh,
we take if our only policy for the people who are homeless is to broaden the encampment, I would like to believe that in this $5 billion bond now, because some of this debate took place before the passage of this, there is immediate money available for things like shelters and congregate housing and even hotels, the worst policy on earth, other than living in a tent.
yeah, it's an expensive one, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Jack, I know we're tight on time, but I want to end on an optimistic note, if that's okay.
Sure.
So
Absolutely.
So first off, I want to pass along the mayor's thanks to these three gentlemen for their work with us in securing some earmarks in the housing bond bill. Representative Cabral alluded to those earlier. We're appreciative. It will help small developers. Small projects are really our bread and butter. That's how we're going to solve this problem in New Bedford. Representative Hendricks also spearheaded the way toward earmarking some funds that will allow us to solve a TOD parking challenge, a transit-oriented development parking challenge, or help with that solution in the city with the support of the other two gentlemen on the call. Our Building the Bedford Housing Plan, we've been busy implementing that for the last year and a half. I got a comment yesterday from someone intimately involved in housing development throughout the Commonwealth who said that we've led the way on that. And New Bedford has been sort of a beacon of hope. That was the quote, beacon of hope, in leading the way on affordability and housing production and embracing this stuff. So for all the difficulties of building housing, for all the difficulties of addressing homelessness, for all the complex policy discussions between rent stabilization and everything else we're talking about, we are on track. If our 900 units that are in the pipeline continue to be the case, we will address the 5,000 unit gap in New Bedford by 2030, which is the number. It's 8,000 plus units in the greater New Bedford region. And by calling for regional collaboration, helping the towns around us, we can get to that number too. We're doing it one 20 unit project at a time, one 50 unit project at a time. But that is the recipe for success and how we'll get there. And so we've got a committed group of people, proud of the Mitchell administration and my colleagues and team here at the Office of Housing and Community Development.
Okay, I'll just tweak you a little bit on that, Josh. 2030 is a long time to wait if you're in a homeless crisis now. If you're in a affordable housing.
Just in housing production though, right? These are multi-year projects. So we've got, a few hundred units coming online each year does get you to 5,000 over time.
Eventually. I want to
No
thank
one's doing it better. No one is doing it faster in an environment like ours here in New Bedford. And so it's important to note that, right? We're on track.
I don't want commercials. This is a discussion show. I want to thank all of you for taking part. You guys, this is a tough issue. I'm a tough interviewer. You took all my questions. We only scratched the surface of the state's plan. This is an issue that's going to be with us. I hope you'll come back. Senator Montigny, Representative Hendricks, Representative Cabral, Josh, thank you all. This has been a great discussion, and I'm sure it'll be enlightening for our listeners and readers.
It was enjoyable.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you all.
Jack. Appreciate it.